Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
As soon as you say that was wrong or that was evil, what you're saying is something that happened, something that is real, is a part of reality, should not have happened. In effect, what you're saying is, I disapprove of those events which are part of the fabric reality, and therefore I disapprove of reality. But if all there is material reality, how can you lay claim to knowledge of some alternate reality which doesn't exist and which you believe should exist? Some invisible, better world that you would have approved of.
Can you believe what he just said? No, Brian. When I disapprove of something, this is not indicative of me looking into or peering into another reality that I wish was the case but wasn't.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today is one Brian Holdsworth, who is a Christian apologist. He's one of those apologists who speaks very calmly and very articulately, and so thereby giving the air or impression of intellectual Christianity, as it has become known. An oxymoron, if ever I've heard one. Anyway, Brian thinks that atheists have a problem of evil, and he's going to explain why that is the case. So without further ado, let's dive right in and find out what Brian's got to say. I hope you enjoy it.
I'm going to share a story of what I consider to be incomprehensible, if not nearly incomprehensible, evil. Because if we're going to try to understand or comprehend something that we currently do not, well, then that should be the focus of our inquiry.
Long story short, Brian tells the story of a horrific murder carried out by a man who then says that he enjoyed doing it, that he liked doing it. Cutting that story out doesn't affect the video whatsoever. I just want to get to the meat of this conversation sooner rather than later. I want to get to the point where Brian alleges that atheists have a problem accounting for this and our resulting judgment of it. With that acknowledged, let's continue.
For whatever difficulties arise for the Christian in reconciling or accounting for this kind of evil, I think there's even a larger difficulty for a materialist atheist, because materialism is the belief that the physical properties of the universe are all that exist. There is no invisible, transcendent dimension of reality, only what can be observed physically.
Just a small point of order here. It's not obvious to me that atheists are materialists. I think a better description would be methodological materialist or methodological naturalists. What's the difference? Well, if somebody is a materialist, a philosophical materialist, or a philosophical naturalist, it means that they're committed to the thesis that all that exists is physical stuff, physical matter, the periodic table of elements. This point of view comes with a burden of proof. You would have to demonstrate that all that exists is physical matter, the periodic table of elements. It's not obvious to me that it's possible to demonstrate that all that exists is physical stuff. And if you go about making an inductive argument here, it's not going to be the most persuasive. Just because we've never seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And if you go down that road, you're going to be engaging in a black swan fallacy, so named because it is a fallacy to assume that black swans don't exist simply because you haven't seen one. This is difficult to do, guys. It's difficult to demonstrate or prove a negative. How would one go about proving that all that exists is physical stuff? Which is to say that you have to prove that nothing non-physical exists. You would have to prove the non-existence of the non-physical, which it seems to me is something of an unfalsifiable proposition. I think most atheists are methodological materialists, which means that we live as though the material world exists, but we don't claim that that's all that exists. If anything, we can be agnostic on the existence of non-physical substances, dualism, or gods, or the supernatural. Suffice to say, it's entirely reasonable to remain unconvinced in any or all of those supernatural or non-physical entities until such time that those who believe in them provide satisfactory evidence. That does not mean, however, that atheists are committed to the thesis that these things definitely do not exist. And so I just wanted to insert this little correction here. I do think that's an important thing to point out. And in my experience, atheists are not philosophical materialists, they are methodological materialists. And that's certainly the label that I would adopt. But with that acknowledged, let's proceed and see where Brian goes with this.
But if you hold this view and you want to arrive at some rational explanation for the events in the story that I just told, you have to account for them by appealing to exclusively material causes. So your explanation would have to be something like evolutionary conditioning in unattached male members of a mammal species causes them to treat the offspring of their rivals as a threat, and therefore they can have a strong instinct to do harm to those offspring. Now, I'm not saying that that is a possible explanation, only that that's the kind of explanation you have to make, in that it appeals to merely material causes and ingredients in the explanation. And if you want it to be a satisfying explanation, it has to be more than just speculative invocation of Darwinian evolution. Because too often, this is a complaint of mine, I find people simply referencing evolution to add legitimacy to blustery speculations that might account for some phenomenon, but with no actual observed evidence to support their claims. If we're really committed to being logically consistent, I think we have to do better than explanations that go something like because evolution, or what I would describe as an evolution of the gaps type argument.
I don't need to speculatively invoke evolution at all in order to explain this behavior. There's nothing about this behavior that is mysterious. It's shocking, it's appalling, it's abhorrent, but there's nothing about it that's inexplicable if you're a methodological naturalist or materialist. There's nothing about the behavior that's inexplicable if you're an atheist. I mean, I just don't know where he's going with this. This doesn't really make sense as a critique of materialism. He seems to be implying that materialism can't do it, that it's not cut out for the job here of explaining what's happening. But there are perfectly reasonable physical explanations for what's going on here. The brain is a complex thing, and things can go wrong with that complex object. This guy who murdered an innocent and enjoyed it, I can suppose and hypothesize about what might have went wrong there. I can imagine that his upbringing was quite poor. I can imagine that there's a problem with his brain chemistry. I can imagine that he was subjected to brutality at some point or another in his life, which might have rendered him a psychopath. I can imagine that there might be a genetic problem which produced this disposition or this behavior. Consider the example of Charles Whitman, the University of Texas bell tower shooter who climbed the tower and shot dead a bunch of people before he was ultimately killed by the police. He left a suicide note where he begged the authorities to perform an autopsy and to look at his brain because he felt a compulsion that he couldn't resist. Lo and behold, when they looked inside his head, they carried out his wishes and they discovered a tumor in the part of the brain that controls aggression. And you're telling me that psychopathic and brutal behavior can't be grounded in a materialist or naturalist worldview? What a load of hogwash. Absolute crap. It's not difficult for an atheist to explain why a murderer might kill somebody in a horrendous fashion. So again, let's just see where he's going with this.
So again, if you're an atheist that believes that all there is and all that happens is accounted for by physical objects participating in a seamless and determined sequence of cause and effect, then any explanation you give for the events in this story I described, they have to follow that same pattern, because that's all there is and that's all you have to work with according to your view. But as soon as you do make an explanation like that, assuming that one is available to you, notice what you've forfeited. It's something that most people would be unwilling to forfeit, by the way. What you cannot say after observing phenomenon like that is that was evil or that was wrong. And we have a very strong urge, instinct, or intuition to react that way when we hear a story like that.
Translated, what he's saying here is that an atheist cannot say that the murder of innocents is objectively wrong. And I agree with him here, but I would agree with this because I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't believe that morality is a factual domain. And what this means is that he can't say that it's objectively wrong either. And his attempt to do so will simply pivot to, well, God said it's wrong, therefore it's objectively wrong. Why? If God says something is wrong, what makes that thing wrong? If it is the case that God says murdering innocents is wrong, it doesn't follow that therefore we ought not murder. That doesn't work. God's claims don't become normative when he makes commands. Why would you assume that? For those of you who aren't sure what I'm talking about, the is-ought problem is a very famous one in philosophy, articulated best, I think, by David Hume. The problem is very basic. No matter how many facts you add to the list of facts, we never get to a point of recommendation about what we ought or ought not do about those facts. And it's because logic is conservative. As Sean Carroll put it once in a debate on stage, garbage in, garbage out.
I think that there's two slightly different claims. One would be the claim that you can derive ought from is, which I think is just manifestly wrong. That's just logically wrong, right? By the rules of logic, garbage in, garbage out. Values in, values out, facts in, facts out. By using the rules of deductive logic, you cannot derive conclusions about properties that did not somehow appear in the axioms or the premises from which you did your logic. So I think that's just a non-starter. In order to derive conclusions about what ought to be true or what should be true or what is morally right, we have to include in our theory an assumption or an axiom that relates to values, that relates to what is good and what ought to do. I think that is a straightforward computational science claim.
If all you add to the system is garbage, you can't get out of it anything other than garbage. That's the way logic works. Logic is conservative. And so too, it is the case with is statements and ought statements. I can tell you any number of facts about Star Wars. I can tell you that it is the case that it was directed, the first one at least, by George Lucas. I can tell you that it is the case that Mark Hamill starred as Luke Skywalker. It is the case that Harrison Ford starred as Han Solo, and so on. I could go on to tell you the cinematographer. I could go on to tell you the date of filming. I could go on to tell you how long they filmed for. I could go on to tell you how much it made at the box office and how it's become a cultural phenomenon, etc., etc., etc. All of these statements are is statements, and I can add an infinite number of them to the pile, and yet we will never get to a therefore you should see it. We cannot get from is to ought. These are different conceptual spheres. They're different logical spheres. Is statements are facts, whereas recommendations are something else. And that also applies to God. You don't get to just destroy the is ought conundrum with God and say, well, God just defeats it. Well, how does God defeat it? Please explain that to me. Normativity is the domain where we give recommendations. If I tell you that you ought not steal, you ought not kill, you ought not XYZ, those are normative claims. If it is the case that God says thou shalt not kill, it doesn't follow normatively from that command that therefore I ought not kill. You have to smuggle in a goal to get from is to ought.
In order to derive conclusions about what ought to be true or what should be true or what is morally right, we have to include in our theory an assumption or an axiom that relates to values, that relates to what is good and what ought to do.
In other words, you can't get an ought from an is, but you can get an ought from an ought. For example, God says thou shalt not kill. To get to therefore one ought not kill, you have to have another ought. For example, one ought follow God's commands. Suddenly, the conclusion works. Now we can legitimately say that one ought not kill. How have we gotten there? It's the premise in between. It's the other ought. So it is the case that God commanded us to not kill. And if we say that we ought follow God's commands, well, then the conclusion is, therefore, we ought not kill. But we didn't get from is to ought there, did we? We got from an ought to an ought. And so too it is the case with the rest of morality. You cannot get from is to ought without another ought in between. And that ought is subjective. How can you say that it is a fact that we ought follow God's commands? No more than I can say that it is a fact that you ought go see Star Wars. It doesn't work that way. The is-ought problem is a significant one in philosophy, and you can't pretend to have solved it by saying, well, God commanded us to do so, therefore the is-ought distinction is obliterated. It doesn't work that way. That's lazy philosophy, it's assertive, and it's just uninteresting, to be perfectly honest. It's a pathetic attempt at creating objective moral duties, objective moral oughts. It just doesn't work, I'm afraid. So yeah, atheists can't solve the is-ought problem either, but this is why I'm an anti-realist. I'm not convinced that morality is a factual domain. There are no moral facts. So yeah, no moral facts. That means that we can't say that things are objectively wrong. Atheists can't do so, but you can't do so either, Brian. This is the problem that I have with apologists. You bring up a philosophical problem that's real and legitimate. The is-ought problem. The question of moral subjectivism. The question of whether or not morality is objective or subjective. The problem of moral relativism. These are real problems in metaethics. And then you point out that atheists can't solve them, and you're right. But your assumption is that your theology can, and yet there's no demonstration that it can.
Whatever difficulties arise for the Christian in reconciling or accounting for this kind of evil, I think there's even a larger difficulty for a materialist atheist.
You just sit there on your high horse. You seem to believe that you're up on a pedestal looking down on us atheists who are squabbling around in our anti-realism and in our inability to solve the is-ought problem. And you just assume by default that your theology can, without any attempt to demonstrate how it does this. There are significant problems with divine command theory. It doesn't work as a moral foundation for anything. Anything can be moral according to divine command. All God need do is command it, and that thing becomes an intrinsic moral act according to your worldview. Worse still, the Euthyphro dilemma reveals that God cannot be the foundation of morality anyway. For if God commands something and then that thing becomes moral by default, then morality is ultimately arbitrary. God could command anything to be moral, including the murder of innocents, which God seems to have a proclivity to engage in the Bible that you hold so dear, I might add. If you take the opposing point of view that God commands things because there's some independent moral standard that he's appealing to, well then God isn't the author of morality in the first place. No matter which option you pick in the Euthyphro dilemma, you have a bitter pill to swallow. So no, theists can't solve this problem no more than atheists can. So to pretend that this is a problem for atheists is either disingenuous or philosophically ignorant. You can decide which one, dear listener. I'm going to move on.
As soon as you say that was wrong or that was evil, what you're saying is something that happened, something that is real, is a part of reality, should not have happened. In effect, what you're saying is, I disapprove of those events which are part of the fabric reality, and therefore I disapprove of reality. To say that is to insist that reality and the events that constitute it should have been and should be another way. Something else should have happened. Specifically, that guy shouldn't have murdered an innocent life, and worse, he shouldn't have gloated about it afterwards as if he did something enviable with complete indifference towards goodwill or the lives that he has now traumatized. But if all there is material reality, how can you lay claim to knowledge of some alternate reality which doesn't exist and which you believe should exist? Some invisible, better world that you would have approved of.
Can you believe what he just said? No, Brian. When I disapprove of something, This is not indicative of me looking into or peering into another reality that I wish was the case but wasn't.
But if all there is material reality, how can you lay claim to knowledge of some alternate reality which doesn't exist and which you believe should exist? Some invisible, better world that you would have approved of.
That's not what's going on here. I'm not peering into some moral universe outside of our own. I'm not peering into some transcendent, non-physical, non-corporal reality. I'm not looking into some platonic world of forms in order to disapprove of something. I can disapprove of something because I have tastes. This isn't that complicated. Let me give you an analogy. If I'm at a restaurant and I order a cheeseburger and I specifically ask the restaurant to leave out the onions, let's imagine I don't like onions. This isn't the case, by the way. I love onions in my cheeseburger, but just run with this. So I ask for the burger without onions. If the burger arrives and it has onions, despite me ordering it without onions, I bite into it. And the taste of the onions is revolting to me, and I puke up onto the table, and I'm horrified. That isn't me peering into an alternative reality where my burger arrived without onions, as I asked. This is just me expressing my distaste, my displeasure, which is perfectly explicable according to the reality that's around us. We have taste buds. We have psychology. We have desires, preferences. This isn't complicated, Brian. If I don't like onions, if I'm revolted by the taste of onions, well then when they touch my tongue, I'm going to have this reaction. None of this requires an appeal to the transcendent or to a platonic world of forms. I'm just expressing my displeasure. And I might be frustrated about that because I've told them in advance that I didn't want the onions. I can have taste on a purely physical, materialist worldview. Nothing about a physical or materialist worldview prohibits the phenomenology of taste and preference. Now, why do I use the example of onions in a burger? Well, guys, morality is no different. I am a moral anti-realist. In my opinion, morality is simply an expression of our attitudes. It is an expression of our taste. It is an expression of our approval or our disapproval with certain behaviors. So when somebody murders an innocent, I can express my displeasure with that action without reference to the divine or the transcendent or a platonic world of forms. My brain recognizes that there is a world and that there is a slew of possible actions that can be completed in this world. Murder is one of them. Charity and goodwill is another one. That is my preference. I'd rather we took care of one another. And there are very good evolutionary reasons why I feel that way. Again, none of this requires a transcendent reality in order to ground it. Now, Brian might accuse me of an evolution of the gaps here.
Too often, this is a complaint of mine, I find people simply referencing evolution to add legitimacy to blustery speculations that might account for some phenomenon, but with no actual observed evidence to support their claims. If we're really committed to being logically consistent, I think we have to do better than explanations that go something like because evolution, or what I would describe as an evolution of the gaps type argument.
But what I'm about to say here is utterly trivial. Evolutionary Psychology 101. We are a social species. So of course we have proclivities to get along with one another and to be kind and compassionate and decent. We wouldn't have gotten this far as a species if we didn't have those proclivities. In other words, the pockets of humanity that thought that murder, rape, and theft were acceptable didn't make it. They didn't pass their genes on into the next generation because they were too busy killing each other, because they were too busy robbing each other, starving each other, and brutalizing each other. The only way humanity can survive to this point is if we cooperate. Reciprocal behavior. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, and all that stuff. The reason babies survive is because evolution and natural selection selects for parents that care for their children. If we left our children out in the cold to die, we wouldn't be here. This is not an evolution of the gaps-based argument. These are trivial claims that are provable, principally speaking, by virtue of the fact that we're still here. Brian doesn't seem to acknowledge that any of this is on the cards. He thinks that we have to appeal to a transcendent other, to a platonic world of forms or a divine reality beyond our own in order to express disapproval.
But if all there is material reality, how can you lay claim to knowledge of some alternate reality which doesn't exist and which you believe should exist? Some invisible, better world that you would have approved of.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is absolutely asinine. This is ridiculous. And the final point I'll make is this. Everything he's saying here is an assertion. He is asserting that there must be some kind of a transcendent moral reality that allows us to make these claims. Prove it, Brian. Prove it, or desist, because I've had enough of it. Let's move on.
But instead, the world that you do observe, that is accessible and available to your physical senses and rational mind, and is therefore observed by science, is one that you object to, and one which at times is a horror to you, which is compounded even further in its strangeness by the fact that you yourself are part of that fabric reality. You are a consequence, a contingent part of this sequence of cause and effect, yet somehow in the midst of that, find yourself disapproving of this whole system which you are contingent upon.
No, I'm not disapproving of the whole system. I'm just disapproving of one little facet of it. If my burger arrives with onions, despite ordering it without, I disapprove of the onions. That doesn't necessitate that I disapprove of the whole system. Are you kidding me? What a leap is that? If I disapprove of the murder of an innocent, it doesn't mean that I disapprove of the whole system. There are many things about this physical materialist reality that I sincerely appreciate. Beauty, nature, love. All of these things are incredibly profound experiences, and before anybody tries to hold my feet to the fire on any of this, yes, all of this is perfectly reconcilable with a materialist or naturalist worldview. So don't even go there. If you want to, jump into the comments below and I'll respond. Perhaps that deserves a video all of its own. But no, I don't disapprove of the whole system, Brian. I just disapprove of certain aspects within it. And again, that's because I have preferences. Preferences that are perfectly reconcilable with the truth of naturalism or materialism. Let's move on.
This raises a massive question that seems unanswered to me by the materialist atheistic worldview, which is, where are you getting this knowledge of this invisible good world that stands in contrast to the visible world, which you claim is the only one that exists? If you have knowledge of this other invisible good world, where does that knowledge come from? And does it correlate to something real?
To describe preferences as knowledge of an invisible different world is absolute insanity.
Where are you getting this knowledge of this invisible good world that stands in contrast to the visible world, which you claim is the only one that exists?
I don't require an invisible other world in order to have preferences and in order to desire that things went another way than how they actually went. When my burger arrives with onions despite ordering it without onions, my disapproval there isn't evidence of me peering into an other world that's invisible. I can get that knowledge from this world because I know that it's possible to receive a burger without onions. It just so happened that I received a burger with onions. I'm not peering into a different invisible world in order to express disapproval with the fucking onions. Are you kidding me? That's a sentence that I didn't think I was going to utter when I woke up today. And so too it is the case with the murder of innocents. I don't need to peer into another world in order to disapprove of the murder of that innocent. I know that there's a range of possible behaviors in terms of how we can treat our children. This guy murdered an innocent child, and it's appalling to me. I abhor it. I strongly condemn it. None of that requires an invisible world. It's because I know how I was raised, for example. I was raised with love, affection, and support. And I lament the fact that this child was robbed of that. None of what I've just said requires an invisible other world, but leave it to atheists to make shoddy, ridiculous assertions like this one. Something as simple as having preferences is evidence for God. I've covered points like this on the channel before, but I swear, everything counts as evidence for God when you're a theist. Well, I guess if you're a hammer, everything starts to look like a fucking nail.
The metaphysician and the philosopher of the classical world, thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, which the Catholic Church embraced in her theology, they do account for this knowledge, rationally no less. They account for it by admitting that there is a dimension of reality which is invisible and which transcends the material world. And since we perceive it, something about us subsists in it, specifically the rational soul.
You are appealing to an unfalsifiable, invisible reality in order to explain a phenomenon that's easily explicable according to materialism or naturalism. But no, you invent the invisible, unfalsifiable other. An unfalsifiable other that you, by definition, cannot provide any evidence for and nobody could provide any evidence against. Not a strength of the view, by the way. Unfalsifiability makes your claim meaningless. It makes it irrelevant. It makes it such that I've probably spent too much time on it already. Appealing to an invisible, intangible, unprovable, and unfalsifiable reality is not rational by my lights, and anybody who suggests otherwise is an idiot, as far as I'm concerned. But that's just my 2 cents, dear listener. Let's get to the end of this, because my patience is running thin.
But the materialists cannot rationally account for it. And yet at the same time, I imagine this same kind of materialist atheist would be extremely reluctant to say, in the setting of the story that I just told, to respond to it by saying, that's okay, that's just part of reality. We have no grounds to say that it shouldn't have happened. It did happen, and therefore it was necessary that it happened, because what happens is all that there is, and to say anything more about it is to act as if there is something more than what happens, or the physical world. And be honest, at least with yourself, if not with me. How many would actually be willing to say that and to mean it? If you consider yourself an atheist, would you be willing to say that? And if not, can you admit that your belief about the scope of reality is gravely insufficient and inadequate as a means of explaining the world that we experience?
I suspect that many of you will wish that you hadn't had to go through this ordeal. And according to Brian, that is evidence of you glimpsing into an invisible other world where you never sat down to watch this video of Magic Skeptic responding to Brian. Ha! Don't make me laugh. What a joke. But with that said and acknowledged, dear listener, I'm going to leave it right there. If you like the video, drop a like on it. It helps out the channel enormously and it costs you nothing. While you're at it, smash that subscribe button and don't forget to check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be kept up to date with all things on the channel and you'll even be notified as and when my latest videos go live. If you'd like to take your support of the channel to the next level, jump into the description box below. When you get there, you'll find a link to my Patreon page. Click that link and you can sign up for as little as £3 per month, and depending on which tier you choose, you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. The last invitation I want to extend is one of the comment section. If you agreed with my criticisms here, jump into the comment section below and let me know why. If you have any constructive criticisms, or you think that my criticism was lacking or could have been better, or if you have a whole other criticism that I failed to mention, please make me aware in the comment section below, because you guys help me with my counter-apologetics journey every single upload, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this one. Alternatively, if you disagree with my thoughts on this, if you are on Brian's side, if you're a theist, jump into the comments below and let me know where I went wrong. I'll happily have the debate with you there. Debate is crucial and important, and we need to rationally argue this and discuss it in order to figure out what the ultimate truth is. So let me know if you disagree. And with all that said, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.